I'm not here to try to change your mind. I am here to educate you on the potential long term effects of taking a birth control pill, for example, as well as what some of the side effects are. And I think something that happens with a lot of women is we forget what it feels like to feel normal or to feel good. And so it can seem like something is working for us when maybe it's not anymore. Welcome to today's episode of What We Tell Our Daughters. In today's show, we're going to be talking about part 2 of birth control. What are the different types of birth control, why you might want to use them or not use them, and what are the things that your doctor didn't tell you about each of these different types of birth control? Because there's a huge lack of informed consent when it comes to what's out there and what's available and the different side effects that each of these different types of birth control carry. So, in addition to the podcast and the video that you have here, there's also a download that goes with this. So, if you prefer to read about each of these forms of birth control, I also have a guide that you can download, and you'll see that in the show notes. But let's go ahead and get started. So, the first thing that I think is really important when we're talking about birth control, and whenever someone is telling you their opinion on birth control, is I'm not here to steer you in one direction or the other. If you tell me that you feel amazing on hormonal birth control, that you've been taking the pill for a long time and it really works for you, I'm not here to try to change your mind. I am here to educate you on the potential long term effects of taking a birth control pill, for example, as well as what some of the side effects are. And I think something that happens with a lot of women is we forget what it feels like to feel normal or to feel good. And so it can seem like something is working for us when maybe it's not anymore. So, one of the purposes of this is to help you start to tune into your body and remind yourself of what it really feels like to be you. And so, if something I mention here stands out to you and you're like, "You know what? Actually, I have been feeling a little off," or "You're right, I haven't totally felt like myself, my joy, my energy, my sleep, any of those pieces." This is one of the areas that you can dig a little bit deeper and look into. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pull my guide up as my guide for today. And if you're looking at the PDF, you can read along with me if you like. I'm not going to read it, but I will use it to help us go in the right order. So, what you'll actually see in this guide, and if you're watching YouTube, I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen because I think it's really helpful to see and not just listen. So, the first thing I've done with this guide is actually create personas. There's 4 different personas that I see when we're talking about birth control. And one I call the free flower. Then we have something called the clockwork queen, the effortless voyager, and the in the moment maven. You may find that you actually fit into multiple of these personas. And of course, we are all multiple personas. We're not all one thing and always one thing. So you're probably going to see that parts of you fit into each of these categories. And I've created these categories more just so that you can start to align yourself with what makes the most sense for you in this moment as your highest priority. So, the first persona, and I won't dive too deep into the personas in the actual podcast today. You can go ahead and read the guide if you're curious. But basically, the free flower I consider kind of the hippie. That would be me, right? That would be the woman who just wants to go with the flow. She doesn't want to worry about taking a pill, etc. Then we have the clockwork queen. I think of these as the high powered, likes a schedule, really likes to be in control of many aspects of their life. And we sometimes see that as a negative thing in terms of like the type A person. But there's a lot of beautiful benefits to being this type of person. And I think that while it's important to pick which one of these is right for you, sometimes it can also be a little bit of a question mark for you to think about. Am I happy being this type of person? Is there anything in my life that I might want to change or that could nudge me in a different direction? So, these personas are meant to help you kind of self identify. But I think whenever we're talking about personas, it should also open up a question for you of whether or not you want to be entirely this kind of person or whether or not there's other pieces of you that you want to bring in. This is a conversation completely outside of birth control. This is more just a self growth, self actualization type of conversation. So, after that, we have the effortless voyager. And I think of this woman as Someone who likes simplicity, likes to be able to just go out and adventure and doesn't want to worry about too much, but still wants to be safe and embody spontaneity at the same time. And then finally, we have the in the moment maven. And this is really the true spontaneous girl. This is like me in college, right? Like, I just want to go out and have a good time and not worry about anything and be free and not be tied down to any one specific thing. So, in all of these, you can see this, there are parts of you that exist. It's really just about picking which one of these aligns with the majority of who you are today or the majority of who you want to be. Now, from there, we're going to actually dive into the different types of birth control. When we're picking a type of birth control, there's a lot out there, and birth control has changed a lot since its inception in the 30? Well, really, since many thousands of years ago, we've been trying to find forms of birth control. What's really important today is two things, I think. One, it's picking the form of birth control that aligns with your biology. So, if you're someone who has a history of anxiety, or maybe you also have a history of depression, or maybe you have a history of blood clots or breast cancer, or any of these things, that's going to affect what type of birth control choice you choose. You may choose to do something that is completely non hormonal, that's not going to mess with any of your natural hormone systems. On the other side of this is picking a type of birth control that aligns with your life goals. So maybe you really need a long term, minimal opportunity to get pregnant type of birth control. Or maybe you're someone that's, a little bit more willing to toss the dice, ride the edge, um, and take a gamble on whether or not you get pregnant. And when I say a gamble, like, oftentimes what we think of when we think of condoms, right? We know they can break. We know they're not 100%. We know there are other types of forms of birth control that are more effective than condoms, but they work well and they work for a lot of people for very good reasons. One, they protect from STDs. That's really important for a lot of women. If you don't have a monogamous partner, you really want to think about that part of birth control, not just the getting pregnant part of birth control, right? And then there's women who are really focused on their career, and having a baby at this moment in time would be potentially, or at least it would feel potentially catastrophic, right? It probably wouldn't be, but it would feel that way. And so that is something for you to consider when you're thinking about, okay, where am I in my life? What is it that I need at this moment for my birth control to be effective and work for me? Which brings me to the main point of birth control, which is your birth control should work for you. It should be aligned with your life. It should help you live your life more, do more of what you love, live with less stress, less anxiety. It should not be feeding into health issues. It should not be feeding into making you feel frustrated or lost or alone, um, or or feeling like you only have one choice and this is it, and you hate it or it doesn't work for you, but this is all you have, because none of those things are true. There is an option for all of you that will fit with what you need in this moment. And so that's part of why I wanted to have this conversation, because I think that sometimes when you go to your doctor and you say, I need birth control, they're going to say, well, I'm going to put you on the pill, right? We hand out birth control like candy in the United States, but very rarely do your doctors talk to you about what does that really mean for your body. Do they tell you that you should be very careful when you're going on long plane rides and you need to walk around a lot and stay hydrated, and your risk of blood clots goes up, and it affects your microbiome, and it will affect all of your hormones, and you actually don't ovulate the same way, or maybe you don't ovulate at all and your period isn't really a period, it's more of just a bleed. So, all of these things are really important to the conversation of which birth control is right for you. And I don't think that most doctors are having this conversation. So, that's why I'm bringing this all here. So, let's talk about the first form of birth control, and that is what we call the fertility awareness method. This is my love. I love this form of birth control because it doesn't interfere with any of your natural hormones. It gives women complete control and also complete understanding of their body. So, one of my ultimate goals in life for all women is to help women understand their body at a very deep level. And that is something that most hormonal birth control does not help you do. It's going to usually mask a symptom. So sometimes it works great because you have symptoms you want to mask, right? Maybe you have PCOS or you have really bad acne, and your doctor has told you, well, let's just put you on birth control and it's going to help. And it actually does help. But what happens when you eventually go off of that birth control? And what message was your body sending before you went on the birth control? Because usually, or always, symptoms don't really happen in a vacuum. They're always a sign of something else that's out of balance deeper under the surface. And that's really what we need to uncover in order to figure out what your body needs and what form of birth control is right for you. We don't need to just put a band aid on it all the time. And I understand that when you're in the moment and maybe you have acne or maybe you have really painful periods and they're just taking you down every single month, it feels like you need immediate relief. And that's okay. If you need immediate relief and birth control helps give you that, great. But then take that relief and use that time as a time to start to put the other pieces together so that you can really understand, okay, what was my body asking me for? Because your body is always sending you a message. So if something doesn't feel right, it's because there's an underlying imbalance that we need to correct. And usually taking a pill doesn't fix, well, almost pretty much always, taking a pill is not going to fix that underlying imbalance, but it might mask it so the symptom goes away. I hope that makes sense. So, all that is to say that one reason I really love fertility awareness method, which is not the cycle method, right? The cycle method is like, hey, I get my period every 28 days. And so I can count on the middle of my cycle, I'm fertile. And outside of that, I'm not fertile. And that my period's always going to come every 28 days. That is completely inaccurate for almost every woman. In fact, they did studies of the average woman's cycle and found that the average 28-day cycle with a 3 to 5 day period was pretty much had by almost no one in the study. In fact, I think 0% of women had this average cycle. It ranges hugely. And so it's unrealistic to expect that your body is going to fall into this perfect 28-day, 3 to 5 day bleed because that's just not reality. And that's not how our bodies work. And they're responding to everything in our environment and to so many things around us. And so, what's much more realistic is figuring out what your typical is. And your typical may vary 3 ish days, your bleed might vary 2 ish days, heaviness might vary, and all of that is completely normal, right? Normal. We're going to say normal. It's not the average, but it is your normal, and it's okay. That is what we would say is an adaptive woman, right? Your body's responding to the environment. That's a good thing. We don't need it to be perfect every single month. If you're listening, I'm doing air quotes. Perfect. So, fertility awareness method is actually tracking symptoms. So, you're tracking cervical fluid, you're tracking how you actually feel. You might be tracking with external devices. So, like I use an Aura ring, for example, to track my basal body temperature, to track when it goes up in the second half of my cycle, which is a good sign that I've ovulated. Um, it's using all of those signs and symptoms to actually put the whole picture together of when you ovulate. And so when you ovulate, you know that's when you're fertile. And usually there's about an 8 day window there where there is a risk of you getting pregnant. About 24 hours after ovulation, 48 hours to be safe, you can no longer get pregnant. But that week leading up to ovulation, sperm can live a long time in the vagina. And so we do have to be careful about how soon before ovulation we have unprotected sex because sperm is very sneaky and it can live a long while waiting for that egg to drop down. So that is the fertility awareness method. And when used correctly, when actually used correctly, that means tracking all of your temperatures, tracking all of your symptoms, tracking your cervical fluid, tracking how you feel. Do you feel like jumping on every man around you or woman around you? That's a good sign that you're ovulating. And so, really taking all of those symptoms into consideration, fertility awareness method is actually much more effective than one might think. And I mean, it is a little bit non-perfect in science in terms of us measuring its accuracy, but I would say it's close to 95 to 98% when used perfectly, right? And let's remember that pretty much no form of birth control is actually used perfectly by women in general. So, this perfect number that we're given all the time, like hormonal oral birth control is 99% effective. Well, how many women actually take their birth control pill at the same exact time or the same 2 hour window every single day? Very few, I think. At least myself as an example, I definitely didn't do that. That's why we call the clockwork queen one of the personas that might do well with that type of birth control because they're actually really good at keeping to a schedule and they thrive on a schedule. Whereas someone like me that really hates a schedule and doesn't do so well with a schedule is not going to do very well with having to take a pill every day at the same time. So, the fertility and awareness method is one of the forms that I like the best. It gives you the most knowledge of your body. It helps you really come in tune with what it feels like to be you at these different times of your cycle, which is one of our superpowers. We have this magic within us to be able to work for our bodies, to be able to do things that really align with our hormonal state at any given point in our cycle. And when we mask those hormone rise and falls, um, we mask our magic and we kind of give it away. So that is one reason why I really love this method and I love to teach about it. The next form of birth control we have, and actually, I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen so that if you're curious about the guide, you'll see that when you download this, on every page, I have an overview of the type of birth control, and then I have a what do women have to say about it. So I've actually pulled quotes from either women that I've worked with or women who I have gotten quotes from them, maybe not personally work with them, but I've asked them um, to tell me a little bit about their experience. And then I've given each type of birth control a scorecard so that you can kind of see where does it fall in terms of ease, efficacy, side effects, health, and then actual protection from STIs. So that's a little overview of what you'll see if you actually download the guide. Then the next one we have is what we would call a vaginal barrier method or a spermicide. So these are the type of birth control actually that my mom used to talk about. And when I was younger, I was like, I don't know what this old fashioned thing is that you're using. And what she's talking about are diaphragms and cervical caps and actual spermicide that you can insert into the vagina that kills sperm. And a lot of times these are used in conjunction. So if you use a diaphragm, they'll often give you spermicide to actually put on the diaphragm to add another layer of protection. These are nice because these are barrier methods like similar to a condom, but they're in the woman's control. So we're the ones that insert it. Depending on which type, it can last anywhere from a few hours to 24 hours. It does need to be taken out, cleaned, etc. But when you don't have it in, there's nothing affecting your body, which is really a lovely thing. And there's no hormones involved, which is also a really lovely thing. There are sometimes side effects from the spermicide, like some vaginal irritation, or sometimes women feel the diaphragm or the cervical cap and they find it uncomfortable. I had a diaphragm once I signed off most other types of birth control because I've tried pretty much all of them. And I found that it worked really well for me. There's actually a new type of spermicide that is basically just lactic acid that helps lower the pH of the vagina and kill sperm just by being super acidic. So that is a really cool and relatively natural way to go, but there is still some vaginal irritation for some women. Keep in mind that the vaginal barrier methods, most of them don't provide STD protection, STI protection. The internal condom can, right? It's a silicone condom that actually fits inside the vaginal canal and it's shaped just like a condom, like a male condom is. And so it does provide that barrier that's needed to protect from STIs. The other ones don't. Next, we have oral contraceptives. So, this is the good old birth control pill. And we talked about this a little bit in the last episode as to how it came to be. But basically, a birth control pill comes in a few different forms. We have estrogen, progestin. progestin is a synthetic progesterone. So if a doctor ever tries to give you a hormonal birth control pill saying this is going to help your progesterone, it won't. Progestin is not the same as progesterone. We also have some oral contraceptives that have just progestin and none of the estrogen. And that can be really good for women who have estrogen sensitive breast cancer running in their family or a history themselves, or they just can't have estrogens because of blood clotting, for example, blood clotting issues. So that is an option. Um, what to be careful with when we're talking about the oral birth control pill is any time that something affects your hormones, it has the ability to affect how we feel. So they've actually done studies that show that women who use hormonal birth control methods have different um, behavior in terms of the partners they choose. And so a lot of times they'll actually choose partners that are more feminine than they are masculine. And there are some anthropological studies that show that women who get off of hormonal birth control, who met their partner when they were on hormonal birth control, actually didn't find them very attractive after they got off of the hormonal birth control. So this is important. And I actually had an anthropology teacher in college who told me that before she married her husband, after he proposed, she was on hormonal birth control. And she was like, I can't say yes to you until I go off of this hormonal birth control for at least 6 months and see how I feel about you. And then after that, I will say yes. No need to be that drastic, but it is an important thing to think about that having a mask on your natural hormone cycles is actually going to change your pheromones. It can change your levels of attraction to certain partners. And so it can really play a role in how we choose our partners and who we're attracted to. From a health perspective, we're affecting everything here, right? The microbiome is massively affected by oral birth control pills. There's a trickle down effect affecting pretty much all of your hormones when we're playing with oral birth control pills, because anytime we pull on one hormone, you can think of your hormones like a web. If we poke here, the entire web moves. And that's how it is with your hormones. So, oral hormonal birth control plays a really big role in changing how we feel. If you've ever taken a pill and you've felt anxious, depressed, sad, just not like yourself, or maybe what you like to do changed, or you didn't like to do the things you used to like to do, all of these are really important to think about. Personally, I just cried and cried and cried for days on end with hormonal birth control for absolutely no reason. That's how I knew that something was wrong. I had no reason to feel sad, and yet I felt sad all the time. The next one, and these forms of hormonal birth controls, anytime there's hormones, they're going to have similar effects as far as just how we feel, but some of them are a bit better as far as health goes. So we also have a skin patch. And a skin patch basically is just like it sounds. It's a patch that you put on, and it slowly you absorb the hormones through your skin. Now, the nice thing about this compared to a birth control pill, for example, is because it's absorbed through the skin, we're not going to affect the microbiome in any large way. That's really important because we're coming to learn more and more about the microbiome and just how important it is for our overall health, our mood, everything. So a patch does have the same hormonal effects, but it doesn't necessarily have quite as large and far-reaching health effects. Same with a vaginal ring, like a Nuva ring. So it is hormonal, but it is inserted into the vagina. So it affects the vaginal microbiome. So some women have a lot of vaginal discharge, or maybe they get consistent yeast infections or bacterial vaginosis because of that change in the flora of the microbiome, the vaginal microbiome. But they're not going to have as many systemic hormone effects usually because it is more localized to the vagina and the uterus. Although many women report feeling, pretty much the same on a NuvaRing type birth control as they do on an oral hormonal birth control. Now, in addition to these more hormonal types of birth control, we also have hormonal IUDs. And while hormonal IUDs also have hormones in it, they have them at a much lower level. And they are inserted into the uterus. So you have to think about, are you willing to put a device inside of you? And do you have any history of issues with your uterus, like polyps or endometriosis? Things like that can make IUDs a lot harder to tolerate, a lot more painful. Personally, I found that I didn't really have a problem with the insertion. A lot of women really struggle with the insertion and find it really painful. What I had the most struggle with was actually once the IUD was in. You know, your doctor says it's local, it's very low levels, you're not going to feel different, it's not going to affect your overall hormone levels. That's just not true. You don't I didn't feel like myself. I felt fully like I was on a hormonal birth control. So, I just want to validate that if you've ever had an IUD or you have a hormonal IUD now and you feel like that, it's not all in your head. This can truly affect how you feel in a big, big way. So listen to your body. It's telling you, it's sending you a message as to whether or not this is working for it. It's our job to listen. We also have things like the copper IUD. So while the copper IUD doesn't have any hormones in it, it can still affect our hormones because copper can raise estrogen in the body. And so I'm telling you, I've had like every birth control under the sun. I've had a copper IUD. And again, I didn't feel like myself. I was really bloated. I was really puffy. I felt really those labile mood swings that didn't make any sense. And of course, my doctor said, it's all in your head. This doesn't make sense. There's no hormone changes going on, there's no hormones in your IUD. But the truth is, it can. Not to mention, the copper IUD also causes a lot of uterine inflammation. So you can have a lot of side effects of yeast infections or bacterial vaginosis, like I talked about. Anytime we're causing that level of inflammation in the body, anywhere in the body, we also get some systemic inflammation, and that can affect so many things, our other hormones, our microbiome, etc., our sleep, all the things. I know I'm talking about these a little bit negatively, and I don't mean to paint them all in a negative light because I know that there are women who really do like some of these forms of birth control and they work for them. And if that's you, I'm not here to change your mind. I just want you to know how they're working and what to look out for. Because sometimes things change and you felt great on something, and then all of a sudden you start feeling not so great and you're wondering why. And you don't even think to connect it with your birth control because you had that IUD put in 4 years ago. But that could be the reason why. So I want you to just draw the lines here, connect the dots, and remember that we're altering our natural state. Whenever we use one of these more invasive or hormonal forms of birth control, and we have to consider how that is affecting our overall health and our overall life. In addition to the IUDs, and as far as hormone goes, we also have the implant. So the implant is a little rod that's actually inserted into the arm, and it slowly secretes hormones over the course of, I think, about 3 years it lasts. Similar, right? It's very low levels of hormones. Oftentimes they'll say they're low enough that they shouldn't really make a difference. But again, remember that our hormones are measured in scale of picograms. That is minuscule. That is hardly anything. So any little change in hormone is going to affect how we feel and how that hormone balance works in our body. And the same things to look out for with the implant, right? If you start to have mood swings, if you feel not like yourself, if you feel like you lose your sex drive, I forgot to mention, like, pretty much all of these forms of birth control are going to affect your sex drive because when you don't have the biological ability to get pregnant, then why would your body want to have sex at all, right? Or there's a feedback system and a feedback loop that starts to happen where if you don't really have the ability to get pregnant, you're not going to have the same sex drive. So, what women find a lot on oral hormonal birth control, for example, is their sex drive just kind of plateaus and goes to zero because they don't have the natural hormone cycles that give them their libido. They don't have any rise and fall in that libido. And they're probably not ovulating either. So, they really don't have any of that natural drive. You have to really create it for yourself when you're in those situations. And half of libido is really in your head. It's about finding a way to be turned on and get excited about your partner. And you have to really play that mental game when you're using something that's masking the hormones that would give you that natural kind of drive. We also have barrier methods, and this is kind of our last big category of birth control. And these are the typical male barrier methods that I'm talking about. So basically a condom, a male condom. We do have the female condom and the female diaphragm and the cervical cap, but this is more kind of relying on your male partners or relying on yourself. You can absolutely bring condoms with you. This is more what I would call like the in the moment maven, right? The woman who just like doesn't want to worry about most things. They want to live in the moment. In the moment, they're like, okay, this is happening. I do have something I can use. This was also me at a time in my life where I relied entirely on having condoms around because one, I was really focused on nursing school. So I probably wasn't expecting to be having sex very often. And I definitely didn't want to be thinking about birth control or how it was affecting my body. I just wanted to feel good because I was so exhausted from school and I was studying all the time. And I wasn't planning on having a long-term partner, and I wasn't really planning on having sex very often, and so birth control was more like a back burner thing for me at that point in time, and I was relying entirely on this form of birth control I had that just lasted for this one moment. I didn't even have to think about it. It's super disposable. I should have mentioned with the female diaphragm or the cervical cap, you usually have to be fitted for those. So it's a little bit more of a process where you have to go to the doctor, get a prescription, get fitted for it, make sure it's the right size. That's a really important piece of that puzzle. And that was just something that I didn't really want to do at that time either. So condoms were the way for me at that point. And so those are really our big categories of birth control. We have combinations of all of those. So sometimes women have oral birth control, but then they also need to use condoms because they're having sex with multiple partners or partners they don't know. And so they also need STI protection. You can mix and match many of these forms of birth control and find what works for you. If you've never done something like the fertility awareness method and you aren't having sex or you have a monogamous partner and you're willing to use a backup form of birth control around the time that you might be fertile, I really encourage women to try it because it is such beautiful insight into how your body feels, how it works when it's functioning at the highest level, how your hormones feel when they're balanced. And this is knowledge that you can fall back on for the rest of your life. So, for example, I'm about a year, almost a year and a half postpartum with our daughter. And I know what it feels like when I'm ovulating. I know what it feels like when I'm having normal cycles, my normal cycle, which is usually around 30 ish days and usually like 3 ish days of bleeding. And so I know very well that I wasn't ovulating for like the first maybe 12 months postpartum. I had zero hormone swings. In fact, I probably felt similarly to a man because when you're breastfeeding, your prolactin is so high, your estrogen stays really, really low. And so I didn't probably have any normal hormone cycle swings that I would have as a fertile woman. In the last few months, my ovulation has started again. With that has come the swing of the second part of my cycle where I have this probably imbalance in progesterone and estrogen because my estrogen is still really low, but my progesterone has come up because I've ovulated. All of this I can explain much more of if you're curious in a different episode or reach out to me and I'm happy to talk you through it. All that is to say that for me, having the knowledge of how my hormones are working at a time when I don't really feel like myself, I don't feel amazing at this moment, but I don't feel bad. I feel generally good. And one thing I think that really helps me feel that way is understanding what's happening with my hormones because I think there's a lot of fear that comes from not knowing why you feel a certain way. And when you can start to understand, okay, this is what's happening, this is how I feel when I'm cycling consistently and naturally, and I can align with this part of my cycle and how I feel, there's a really amazing power and strength that comes from knowing that you can tap into and harness to create, to do more or to do less if that's what you need in that moment. And that's what I want for all women. But I also want you to pick what's right for you and right for you in this moment in your life. And so, this guide that I created in this episode is to help you kind of shine a light on the different forms of birth control that are out there, why they might work for you, why they might not. If you have any questions, please post it in the comments or reach out to me personally because this is one of my favorite topics and I could talk about it all day for many, many different reasons. And I love helping women find their magic and find what works for them and become as in touch with their bodies as is possible. So that is my hope for you. I hope that you found this helpful, and I will see you in the next episode.